Chapter 7 Sorcerer's Isle. So began, in shed blood and desperate pain, the time of Elof's thraldom. And in blood and pain also it was to end. But that end was to be long in coming, and destined to be the ending of many other things besides. Neither Elof nor Rock could foresee it, and for them those first days were black days, as black as any since their youth. They knew they could count on no aid from Kermorven and Ills. To their friends, they would simply have vanished into the ocean's trackless wastes, and grieve as they might, with the weight of kingdoms upon their shoulders, they would be unlikely to risk themselves or others on the same journey.
"And here's hoping they don't," said Rock glumly, "for they'd simply sail all unwitting into the arms of the Ekwesh, and without your ways of winning help."
He swore, and sank his head in his hands.
"How about his weirdness, Master Raven? Now I'd even be glad of his brand of aid, though the thought of it puts years on me. Can you not get word to him?"
Elof, curled up on a pallet with his maimed legs tucked under him, stared into the darkness and sighed. "Since I began this voyage, all has gone amiss as never before. So he warned me, and I defied him. He will not aid me now. Perhaps he cannot." He listened a moment to the sound of the river waters lapping against the shore far below, and leaned his weary head back against the timbered wall. "No, my old friend, this is something I must accept."
"Well, you may, but I bloody well don't have to."
Elof shook his head at Rock's sharp outburst. "I spoke only of myself, Rock. This is no affair of yours, any more than it was in the marshes. You are not crippled. You have nothing to hinder you escaping." Rock snorted like an ox.
"Oh, yes, I do. That get of a mongrel bitch Nithade landed his darts right in the gold, neat as pie. For one, I haven't got you this far to leave you now. Why the hell'd I spill all that sweat in the first place? For another, where can I escape to? The Duergar? The Ekwesh? Or the depths of the bonny blue sea? I can't sail a ship worth a damn. Still less can I plot a course. No, my lad, I've taken in the same snare. Here I am, and here I stay, till we've got some way of prying you loose."
"But do you not see?" Elof groaned. "You're his chiefest hold over me. If you weren't in his hands too, I could refuse to labor for him, even if he had me tortured half to death."
"Which he would. And then the whole way, if you still resisted. He'll balk at nothing, that one, as we've cause to know. Think I could suffer escaping knowing it meant that? Could you, in my place?"
Elof grimaced. "Like to think not." "Very well, Rock. You have the advantage of me there."
"Not I. Circumstances. And it's surely not worth having your gullet slit just to keep your smithcraft from his paws. It's a king of our kinfolk, he is, after all, and foe of our foe."
Elof laughed bitterly. "So I told myself, and so sought his aid. Should I have not been warned by the manner of land he ruled? A chieftain of brigands I named him, and brigand he is, ruling by main strength and by fear. by no law save the absolute whim of his will. He hates the ice, I guess, as he would hate anything which threatened aught that was his. For the evil behind it, for its threat to all men, he cares nothing. Let it do its worst, so long as it leaves him alone. And it might, Rock. One day, it might. If he gives Lohi a hard enough fight, as he is strong enough to do, can he but hold his realm together, she may decide our land is the easier target after all. Rock's alarm was evident in his voice.
You'll never get him to go after her, then. And a sudden assault? After years of peace? Powers, Elof, what do we do?
What can we? Or what we can? Elof felt a change within himself, deeper than any mere mood. His voice grew suddenly harsh in Rock's ears, as grim and dark as his time-eaten iron. He is a fool who incurs without need the wrath of a master-smith. For had Nithade used us with any honor, we would have worked strong smithcraft enough for him. It fitted our purpose. Even so fell a hand as his I might have strengthened, seeing no other way to unite the land. But now we bide our time, you and I, and use that time to seek the means of freedom for us both. And shall we not find it, who in our youth defied the will of powers? On that day all pacts shall fail, all reckoning fall due. Then let him beware. His reckoning is heavy enough now. If he lets fall the struggle against the ice, the weight may crush him.
Great words,
said Rock, the more acidly because he knew himself was daunted by the voice in the darkness, so unlike the friend he knew.
But breath alone won't bring them to pass.
The voice grew softer, slower, and yet more sure. Yet, for all that, we shall make them be, you and I. We shall quarry our misfortune, we shall smelt it, you and I. Out of suffering render vengeance, molten in the in the forge of pain. We shall strike it on our anvils, ere the fires within shall die, and from vengeance temper freedom that shall shatter every chain. The more firmly I am fettered, all the freer I shall stride. The more cruelly I am pinioned, all the further I shall fly. The more harshly I am crippled, all the more I shall be free. It was sinking now, like the last embers of a dying fire, almost to a whisper on the edge of sleep, mingling with the circling wind in the trees. And he shall see it, the more clearly he shall see it, and in seeing shall he. King Nithade had been generous, after his lights, to his valuable thrall. Also, perhaps, he had not been unmindful of his own safety. When Elof collapsed, he had had him taken and cared for in rooms of the palace, rather than any of his dungeons. But every door and window had been well guarded. In a day or so, when Elof was recovering his strength, their old acquaintance, Argus the sergeant, had come with a detachment of the royal guards, to which he had been promoted, and conveyed them unobtrusively down to a light longboat and out to one of the islands that lay in the Yskinus, around a half-league offshore from the city. Its southern face was unwelcoming, yellow cliffs rising to a roughly fertile country of scrubland and small woodlands, with many oaks, chestnuts, and pines on the upper slopes. Its northern side, though, rose more gently, and over a wide part of it, single sweeping slope, smooth and grassy, led to a hill top crowned with a great stand of oaks, ancient and gnarled, contorted like grotesque dancers as they swayed in the river breezes. There he had settled them in the shell of an old building, built half of wood, half stone, in a pleasant nook high on the island's upper slopes, by the side of a swift stair of waterfalls, and well sheltered by the oaks. Once, he told them, it had been a comfortable hunting lodge, used by those who came to hunt the island's game, which was rich and diverse. It included small herds of rare creatures, perfect cousins of the enormous mammoths found in both Elof's land and this, yet no larger than a dog. In later times, the lodge had sometimes housed noblemen sentenced to mild terms of exile. That, he said, might account for the slightly unhappy reputation the island had among the more ignorant peasants. And certainly nobody cared to come there now. So, since neither Nithade nor his father and grandfather before him indulged in such lenient punishments, it had fallen into neglect and near decay, leaving barely one room sound, abutting the rock face behind. But that very decay had stripped away enough of the wood to reveal, unmistakably to Elof and Rock, the unshaken foundations of a magnificent smithy in the stone. Here, beneath the lodge's fireplace, was a hearth, wide but well-shaped, with the remnants of what must have been a tall chimney, cunningly flewed. Other lesser hearths were arranged around. Here were solid bases for huge anvils, such as they had not seen outside the tower of the mastersmith Milio. And, as in that eerie place, there were recognizable mounts for tall water wheels and channels from the many falls above. He was a master indeed who built this, said Elof admiringly. How came it into disuse? Can't say nothing of that, said the sergeant, rather uneasily. His manner, though not unkindly, had become noticeably more curt and domineering, as if to underline that he had to do with thralls now and not emissaries. Must have been 300 years past, or more even. The Lord Nithade commands you build it anew for yourself. All by myself? Inquired Elof sardonically, tapping the stones with the crutches of green birch the guards had cut for him. With his legs splinted straight, he could already move surprisingly well for short distances, aided by the great strength in his arms. The sergeant sniffed humorlessly, and handed him a sheaf of waxen tablets. Tomorrow we return with the first load of stone, and all else necessary. If there's anything special you'll need in the building, do you write it here. Lord Nithade grants you such tools as you bore, and all else in Amelis's smithy. It will be packed and sent when the smithy is ready. Before, snapped Elof, scribbling furiously. I'll need to forge ironwork for the building, and it must be packed by a smith. If he had a library, I'll want that also, and safe housing for it here, and any other books Nithade can spare, of smithcraft or otherwise. The sergeant sniffed again. I doubt there'll be many. What a king be wanting with books now? He glanced down the long list Elof had scrawled, and his wispy eyebrows shot up. By the gate! I'd as soon not be the one gives him this. Him in a rage, He deny anything to anybody. So I have observed, said Elof flatly. But this is the smithy I must have, to work of my best. If he wishes less, he has only to choose. Tell Nithade. Shaking his head, the sergeant shambled away down the slope to the boat, and left Rock and Elof to spread their bedding in the last remaining room. It was there, alone and free at last to speak openly as the long summer twilight faded into night, that they held that desperate conclave. It proved the first of many they were to have during the weeks, the months that followed after, which at last grew into long years. At the next day's dawning, the guards returned. To the sergeant's astonishment, when shown the list, the king had simply grunted and told him to see to it all, adding that there was no measure more wasteful than a half measure. All that Elof had asked for had been sent, including, to his delight, his precious pack of tools. He tore it open and sighed with relief at finding it untouched. The gauntlet was there also, his explanation evidently believed. But to the dismay of the smiths, all else necessary turned out to include not only building stuffs, but also a pack of thralls to do the actual labor. Peasants, passive and stolid, stooped by continual labor and poor feeding, burned to a brick red by the strong sun of these southern lands. Though the guards were not especially brutal, they drove and harried these hapless, ragged creatures to their labors like mere livestock, till Rock felt his blood boil, and Elof no less. But at the same time, he would seize upon some detail and goad all within reach to amend it, guards and thralls alike, till it was to his satisfaction. Impatient at his own weakness, he drove them so furiously that even the cowed thralls called down curses upon his head. At last, maddened with frustration, he plunged in among them, and, crutches and all, began trying to heave about blocks of stone with his own strong arms. Rock had practically to haul him away, lest he injured himself any further, and he sat aside with his hood drawn over his face. They might have thought him angry, but in truth he wept, and despised himself for weeping. What had been done to his body, any man might have found hard to accept. But for Elof, who from his youth had always been impatient of the weaknesses of flesh, it was a terrible torment, and it almost broke him. It was a torment that he could not forget, even for a second, even in sleep. Each night he dreamed of running, free and strong and tireless. Then his maimed legs would jerk and thrash, and the pain of his scars would awaken him. Already despising himself for the follies that had led to all this, he could hardly have felt less of a man now had they truly unmanned him. He had learned to walk on crutches quickly, not because he had adjusted to his present fortunes, but because he could not. It was this same impatience that made him drive himself and led him to bully the thralls. But when it came time to eat, he fed them well from the store of decent provisions Nithade had sent him, though the guards protested it was better than their own. "Why not?" he inquired coldly. "If I am to share their fetters, they are my brethren, and shall share what I have. You who deem yourself free servants, be content with what your master provides, or try a thrall's life for yourself. I am sure he will oblige you." The soldiers grumbled still, but made few attempts to hinder him thereafter. They feared him for his influence with Nithaid, but still more as a mastersmith of proven power, which to them was a unique and fearsome thing. Had he not been a thrall, they would still have had to salute him as they had Amalus, falling to their knees before him. From talking to them, he had come to expect this, and from his reading in Amalus's library when it arrived, he understood why. Smithcraft in this land had long been caught up in the struggle for power, the secrets of its mastership even more jealously guarded. They had become something to be handed on only to a chosen few, and in great secret. The fewer mastersmiths there were, and the less widespread their knowledge, the greater became the power of the remaining few. Over many generations, that process had taken its logical course, their number being constantly whittled down until in the end there was only one true mastersmith in the land at a time, a powerful servant of the king. But with the dwindling of the mastersmiths, the breadth of their experience also fell away, and hence their knowledge. Much was lost, and little added. Thus the craft of journeyman and apprentice was impoverished, as was that of the masters who rose from among them. It was a slow process, but it had been going on, he guessed, since before his own land of Norderney was founded, 1,000 years past. He found now he could understand Amalus better, pity him almost. Any man who had risen to where he had would inevitably have had to be more the scheming courtier than the smith. And for such a man to be confronted with another he could see at a glance was infinitely more powerful, more capable, and half his age? How could he help viewing him as a rival?
But Nithaid saw through him,
objected Rock.
Seems he always did. And yet he didn't stop the old bastard crippling you.
Why should he? Inquired Elof bitterly. Did it not suit him well to lose a bad smith for a better? A free man for a thrall? A whole man for a dependent cripple? All without having to lift a finger? Rock grimaced.
So that was what you meant. He expected it. He was letting you do his dirty work for him all the time.
He was, Elof replied coolly, running his fingertips over the wallstones of the forge with an absent-minded caress. He is clever, Nithaid. Too clever for Amalus, too clever for me, who saw through him only when the deed was done. In every way, he has ruined me, that wise brigand. He has stolen from me all the things I still treasured most. He has made me both his victim and his tame murderer. For that I told him I would crush him. And so I shall, Rock. So I shall.
But not today,
said Rock quickly, his eyes darting to the approaching boats. Elof smiled thinly. No, my friend, not today. My wits may be crazed across, but they are not wholly shattered. Today he comes to see what is costing him so dear. See he shall, and may his cleverness teach him due respect for true smithcraft.
It might at that, said Rock, relieved. It's impressive enough, that forge. Almost as fine as old Milio's lair, or your own in the guild hall. and may I live to set foot in there again one day. Who'd have thought this old ruin would shape up so neat?
Well, I did, smiled Elof. Right from the first moment I set eyes on it, there it seemed to be, just as you see it now, exactly the way it was.
Why?
Cut in Rock sharply, but Elof had already stopped short.
How are you so sure of that, then?
They looked at each other a moment, questioningly. I don't really know, Elof admitted. I just saw it, that's all. That's all, he insisted, as Rock opened his mouth to ask something more. Come, the boats are beaching. Come. He snatched up his crutches and with ungainly energy slammed the shutters closed and swung himself out of the door. Rock lifted his eyes to the naked rafters in mute appeal for patience, and stumped out after him. With no less vigor, Nithade swung his heavy frame over the gunwales, thumped down onto the chalky sand, and squinted up at them. Behind him, splashing into the shallows, sprang his guards. The king waved an imperious hand upslope and set off at a great pace, the guards doubling to keep up with him, their plumes tossing in the breeze. He reached the forge, red-faced and a-sweat, and stood with hands on hips, glaring at them and saying nothing. The guard, a dozen or so, closed in around him, their scarlet spears held trailing but ready for immediate use. Elof gave no sign of noticing them, and inclined his head politely to Nithade. Your thrall regrets his inability to come down to meet you, he said with elaborate politeness, or make the usual obeisances. The crutches, you see. For a moment, their glances clashed, but Nithade's smile was all bluff and genial condescension.
Well, I could hardly insist, would I now? Take it that you're relieved of all such obligations to me, Valant, as to the least of free men, eh?
He gestured impatiently at the smithy.
What do we tarry for, then?
But he glanced uneasily at the freshly painted door as he entered, and many of the guard balked visibly. For Elof had set patterns and symbols upon it in strangely worked brass, and they guessed unhappily at their potency. At its heart was the mighty character of the sun, worked in the Norderney style, and the look of it in its central eye was bleak and baleful indeed. What they saw, as their sight grew used to the shadows beneath a temporary roof of sailcloth and boards, was no more reassuring. Two huge water wheels dominated the forge, and as the king entered, Rock spun open the sluices. Water diverted from the falls leaped and thundered under the roof and crashed down upon their blades of iron unrusting, and with many a protesting creak, strange devices came to life. Sighing like a giant, bellows taller than a man drew breath and blew in the same pass, and all around the room the hearth fires roared into sudden, dazzling flame. The red-white light danced about the strange-shaped ironwork that supported the roof, browning the beams and bringing eerie life to the grimacing masks of the crouching beasts that formed the brackets. Grinding wheels and shaping lathes, crushers and sifters, driven by pulleys of many sizes, hissed swiftly to life, and with ponderous smoothness, a tall column of blackened steel surged straight up towards the rafters, slipped free suddenly, and dropped down upon a high anvil with a crash that seemed to shiver the air. Lesser hammers beat a rippling rhythm on blocks of chiming iron, sharp sounds that lanced through the ears and severed thought from thought. Against this torrent of sound, Nithade stood stolid and unmoving on his squat legs, his guards clustering close about him as if he might protect them. Elof waved a rock, and the sluices were shut again. The empty silence seemed as terrible as the noise, but Nithade was yet undaunted.
"That's a pretty show," he remarked skeptically. "But I've seen better in the arena, Valant. Fine to look at, but what may you do with it all? There's the rub. Crows you may scare off with such a din, but never the eye switch. So much expense upon the thrall, and now he's demanding still more. Time we saw some results from you, my lad."
Elof smiled calmly. "Do you look over upon that anvil, then?" Nithade stared, blinked, then with a muffled curse, he stalked forward and lifted from the anvil some pieces of plate armor with patches of mail about their edge. They had something of the same bronze hue as Amulus's, but no other resemblance. Each link of the mesh was most cunningly and intricately worked against its neighbor, so that when Nithade laid a piece across his hand, the mail became almost a solid surface, merging imperceptibly with the plate. "You commanded an armor of me," said Elof quietly. "These are its trial pieces, made of such materials as Amulus kept to hand. I will need more, and better. It will be a suit of plate and mail combined, in the style of Morvenhall, and the mail will also close thus under the weight of a blow. The harder that falls, the more firmly it will be driven together. The mesh as a whole has virtues of strength and unity within it, but upon each ring is set a virtue of moving freely and unhindered. I have learned to value that of late. Well, as I have begun, shall I go on? When you send me the makins—"
"You will have 'em. You'll have 'em,"
crooned Nithade absently, greedily caressing the mail as if it were costly silk.
"Oi, finish it, soon as you may."
Then, recollecting himself, he added gruffly,
"I've need of haste. Summer ends, and with the mists of autumn the reavers grow bolder. The king must start a new campaign, or lose even more support from the outlying lords who bear the brunt. I hate to fight in armor that was dead men's, and what's borrowed never fits my belly. So, list all you need, but no waste, mind."
He peered around suspiciously.
"Like those heavy roof timbers you've the nerve to demand. Each one the month's keep of a cavalry squadron, if any can be found of that size, that is. We're forever short of large timber in this land. Why not just cut down the oak wood, stand atop the hill, and use them, as my lads would have you do?"
Elof snorted impatiently. "Aye, and lose the roof itself to the next winter gale without their shelter. Anyway, you feel the heat of the fires, even under this high roof? It takes well-seasoned timber to bear the heat of a forge for long." He forbore to add that he was simply too fond of the trees anyway. Fortunately, it was highly unlikely that any such idea would occur to the king, though Nithade had a mind both acute and acutely suspicious. It cost Elof most of the day's work, not to mention all the shreds of patience he could summon up, to convince him that the timbers and materials he had demanded were necessary.
"Well, then,"
grumbled Nithade at last, as he cast a last severe look around the forge,
At least you'll not be able to claim I denied you aught, Master Smith. If I'd a court as perfect as this forge, I'd hammer out a sound enough realm, let me tell you.
Would you? Inquired Elof coldly. A master does not despise his metals, King. And though the forge is well enough as it once was, it is hardly perfect. I need more heat. Fierce heat. Fiercer than a common fire can yield. Heat to soften stubborn metals, to consume others and bear new substance from their blending. At the very least, I need a furnace of some kind for my studies and trials. Amalus cannot have understood a 10th part of that library of his. There's much new to me within those books that I must wrestle with.
Is there now? And to what end?
What end is a babe newborn? I have known the strangest oddments prove vital. But where knowledge is dangled before me, I must have it, King, as you must your dominion. No other passion rules me save one, and that is deep in eclipse.
Well, do you burn your heart to feed your forge, then? No, you'll have no costly construction of me. If fiercer fires you want, you yourself must find them. And meanwhile, have a care of that armor.
As Nethaid's boat pulled away, and his guards scrambled hastily back into the other, Elof flung the shutters wide and drank deep of the cool air. Rock grinned as the sunlight flooded the smithy, and made it an airier, fairer place altogether.
You were right. Far better show it made, all in shadow like that. Fairly shook the brute for all his calm. And look at those guards hop. They'll not be too eager to come back to Elan Gorenhayen again.
Sorcerer's Isle, is that what they're calling it? Well and good. Let them keep a clear berth. There'll be fewer prying eyes and ears for Nethaid then. And with those timbers, we'll have the forge complete within a week. He pondered. Save for the furnace. But any ordinary furnace would barely meet our need anyway. He was right, Rock. We must find some means for ourselves. The makings of the armor arrived the next day, heaped on the shore by a nervous boatman, who all but fled when the smiths approached him. Elof set to work then in earnest, forming stiff wires of bronze and many other metals, shaping and entwining them with soft-sung words into intricate forms. Most he left free and flexible, but some, for the vulnerable surfaces of the joints, he shaped into the close-knit chains that flowed like thick cloth through the fingers, yet braced and locked against one another when struck. Forming the plates was an easier matter, but he did not skimp it, and set their surfaces with ornament carefully shaped to deflect any impact. Then, little by little, he linked them with the mail, fitting them carefully around the same form Amalus had used. It was a hard task, and tedious. Hardly taxing to a mastersmith like Elof, but he threw himself into it with such fierce energy that by the time the thralls returned with the new roof timbers, some 3 weeks later, the armor was nearing completion. It stood on the form in a corner of the forge, squatly grotesque, to his tormented mind a disturbing likeness of Nethaid. All the worse in that he had not yet shaped the helm, and it was headless. It haunted him, and he longed to be rid of it. Yet for his pride's sake, he would not hurry the work. But a strange quirk grew in him, and when Rock, who had been supervising the work on the roof, saw the completed helm, he was appalled.
"You're never sending him that."
Elof shrugged. Why should I not? He will know it for better work than any he can have seen.
Aye, but...
Words failed Rock. And indeed, the effect of the helm was not easily described. It was of the same dark bronze hue as the armor, beautifully ornamented in gold, but there was little fair in its aspect. It sat upon the armor's broad shoulders in the shape of a huge bull's head, shaped as from the life, as closely as one could who had herded such beasts in his childhood. Its horns were short and turned down against the brow to ward off blows, lowered as if for the charge. But there was also a strongly human cast to that countenance, though it was hard to find it in any single feature, and the look upon it was appalling, lowering, threatening, basely brutal, yet fiercely aware, most bestial in its likeness to men, or rather, to a man. For the whole cast of those features, and most of all the look in those pouched golden eyes, cold and menacing, was beyond mistake. That helm, work of craft and strength though it was a mockery closer and more deadly than any dart it might deflect, a distorted likeness of Nethaid. All Rock's objections Elof brushed aside. The armor was packed up and dispatched to Nethaid that evening with the returning work party. Rock groaned as he watched their boat pull away from the shore, but Elof only chuckled. Even he would not slay us for that, not when it is such a proof in itself of our worth to him. But I would I were there to see the conflict in him, between his greed and his pride. You saw how he drooled over it. But what will he do now, I wonder?
"Ah, well," sighed Rock, "he might well burst a vein in his rage. That's always something. We can only hope." "But it wasn't so much that was worrying me. It's you. Dependable soul you've been all the years I've known you, from the moment you got out of the master smith's clutches onward. Serious like. Never your brain, Merry Andrew. But a good lad none the less. And now, all of a sudden you show up this quirky jesting side. And a jest with savage teeth at that. What's got into you? You're changing."
Elof's brows knitted, and for a moment his own face wore the look of the bull mask. Say rather, I am changed. In lasting pain, my sword and my freedom torn from me, even the power to walk. What may I do but put a keen edge on my wits? But I am still myself, Rock. Have no fear.
"You're still the man I know, aye," grunted Rock. "But there's a hint of one I'm not so familiar with, also, and I do fear for you most of all."
But when the guard returned early next morning, they bore with them tidings from the king that neither man expected, and more besides. Nethaid, it appeared from the sergeant's account, had gazed upon the armor a long while in silence, as if astonished, while the court held its breath. Then he had crowed like an enraptured child, insisted upon being fastened into the armor at once, and had jingled about the palace in it for the rest of the evening.
"And for all I know, he slept in it,"
grunted the sergeant. "For sure I saw him set off for a ride in it at first light." He scowled at them. "A sharp a piece of kiss my arse as I ever saw, that likeness. A fly pair you are, for all your fine words. Brown noses with the best of the courtiers." "You mean," asked Elof faintly, "you think that image is a flattery?"
"Well, surely," trumpeted the sergeant. "Fairly brings out the king in him, that does. And doesn't he know it? Wait till the lords clap eyes on him in it. He keeps saying that'll scare him into line. In the army, and the savages, by various curlies, they'll brown their breeches and run a league. Don't believe me? Well, believe this. He sent you by me a mort of delicate meats, enough for a 2 days' feast, and a hogshead of strong wine, all to yourselves. Though by my lights the bearer of such glad tidings might rate a swig, if, being such thirsty work telling 'em."
"Help yourself, and gladly," said Elof, sagging on his crutches.
"You don't think Nithade was just bluffing it out?"
Rock inquired, as the sergeant stalked purposefully back to the boat. "He might have been," said Elof. "He has the wits. But no, you heard the sergeant. He liked it no less. What a folk to fall among! What a land!" That evening, Elof climbed by himself to the hilltop, and with him, though he was little given to deep drinking, he took a large jug of the wine. There he sat for a long time on a rocky outcrop, watching the sun sink through a sky that flared in shades of scarlet and smoke, looking to the west that held so much he had lost. Rock, sensing his mood, let him alone until well after dark. When he did go to search, bearing a brand from the fire, he found his friend sprawled insensible among the roots of the oaks. He was stirring and moaning as if ridden by nightmares. But the next day, though little affected by the drink, he remembered nothing. Only the flesh of his legs about the silver fetters, which had been healing well, was bruised and bleeding again, as if someone had been tugging at them. But from that day on, Elof grew calmer, and outwardly, at least, more content with his lot. He readily agreed with Rock that their life on the island called Elan Gorenhayen was no great hardship in itself. They had both endured far worse in their time. The smithy was comfortable, and seemed well sheltered from inclement weathers. It was lonely, perhaps, but no worse than the mastersmith's tower in their youth, and it was infinitely better than being cooped up in Nithade's palace. It held even some slight consolations for his worst sorrows. The loss of Kara still burned in his breast, but here, at least, he dwelt far closer to her than if he had remained at home. And that could only increase his chances of seeing her once again, even helping her somehow. Beyond that, he did not dare think. And he was also closer to Lohi, well placed to work for her downfall. And that task was next most dear to his heart. As the autumn drew on, and cold winds from the north whipped up the waters of the great river and scoured the island, he buried himself even deeper in his studies. These were copious, for Nithade had sent him not only Amelis's library, but great numbers of scrolls and fan-folded tomes from the palace. For the most part they were dirty and neglected, spotted brown with sharp-smelling fungus, and even chewed by vermin. Evidently the sergeant was right in thinking the court had little use for books, least of all such difficult and crowded texts as these. But Elof had, for among them were not only works of smithcraft, but recondite histories and minute chronicles, profound studies of the earth and the skies and the waters that freed his restless mind from the confines of his hobbled body and sent it questing back and forth across the world. He labored long on good arms and armor for Nethaid's courtiers and lords, but these were to him casual and trifling works that occupied only half his thoughts. While he twisted the cooling breastplates this way and that beneath the fall of his hammers, or set keen edges on swords and halberd against the grinding wheels, his mind turned over strange and arcane fragments of his reading, purified and refined them, welded them together into larger, stronger structures of knowledge. So time passed, a year, autumn to autumn, and another year after that. Scant detail is given those years of captivity in the chronicles. They are recorded in the terse and cursory fashion common in matters which the chroniclers must have thought unimportant, or of which Elof was not proud. Often they are like pages read beneath the gloom of gathering storm clouds. Yet from time to time a bright light illumines some event, and it stands out in stark relief against the rest. So, perhaps, these must have seemed to Elof and Rock in their thraldom, rare blazes of levin light against the oppressing skies. If the chronicles recount them in such detail, while ignoring or merely glancing over so much else, that is only to be expected. All through the years of his thraldom, a fierce strife was raging throughout the land of Caris. In small bands at first, and sometimes unpredictably in substantial armies, the Ekwesh were striking more and more often into the lands of Caris itself. They never sought to hold territory, or even linger any longer than they had to in one place. They came to destroy and pillage, and when they had done, they moved on. Fighting them was like chasing quicksilver, yet fought they had to be. The border lords who bore the brunt of their incursions grew more and more restive under Nethaid's hand. What were they paying his levies for, they demanded, if not protection? But that protection he simply could not give to each and every one. He had to guess as best he could where the next strike would come, and gather his forces there, or risk losing them piecemeal. Often, too often, he was wrong, because, he suspected, hostile eyes were watching him and his movements. So did Elof, though whose he never said, and only because of this is it mentioned. Those great events the chroniclers chose to treat remotely and from afar, as Elof himself saw them, and not without reason. For in the end it was he who mattered. To those of Caris who had lived through that time, who saw their fields laid waste, their homes burned, their kinsfolk slain, and at last, perhaps, their own blood freezing even as it spilled across the uncaring snow, it was the breaking of a world. Yet in small things, the fall of a feather, the opening of a long-closed door, lay the roots of other events against which that strife was to seem almost insignificant. Not even the powers who from their strange heights watched the wintry slaughters, or the no less bloody counters that followed, when Nethaid the bull with the black blade would hunt the reavers back to the very snow lines, and set heads upon every burned tree in gruesome mockery of spring. Not even they could weigh events with the certainty of the chronicles. For theirs, in all its stark irony, is the judgment of time. and time ruled those many lives and deaths to be ultimately of small account. Perhaps there was a purpose in each, but if so, even from the powers it is hidden, for they also dwell within time, and it is mightier than they. Elof and Rock, for their part, eagerly followed Nethade's campaigns, when they could come by any news of them, and were grateful even for such scraps and rumors as the guards who brought provisions could tell. The sergeant, when he came, was most forthcoming of all. The first news he brought set the pattern, that Nethade had won his most telling victory against the Reavers for many a year, decimating and driving off a powerful warband in a series of pitched battles over the northern grasslands, himself leading the charges of horse as was his custom, clad in a fearsome new armor that no weapon could mark, and doing great slaughter with a black sword, whispered among the common soldiers to be the gifts of a dark sorcerer. By the next spring, it was being said that the armor transformed its wearer into a raging beast man with the strength of 10, and the Ekwesh had come to fear their enemy as a warrior of the powers, many fleeing at mere sight of the bronzed bull's crest advancing. Elof knew that word of this, and of the many like victories in the years that followed, must inevitably come to the ears of Lohi, and even as the thought of Gorthar and Nethade's ham hand galled him, it filled him with a grim satisfaction and a desire to thwart her still farther. So it was that he and Rock were anything but idle. There are clues both in the words of the chronicles and from marginalia and drawings copied in the earliest texts as to their many works and achievements in these first years of their captivity. And if these were not spectacular in themselves, they were undoubtedly of vast value to Nethade in the defense of his realm. In addition to the fine weaponry they crafted for the noblemen, the two smiths shaped many templates and pattern pieces that lesser smiths could copy in large numbers and at low cost, setting upon them simple virtues by fixed formulae, so that the common soldier also could be better armed and shielded. And it is said that many lives were saved so, and Nethade grew greatly in the regard of his men. When, in that second winter, a town fell bloodily to the Ekwesh through poor fortification, its walls shattered by frost and the weight of snow, Elof grew interested in the art, and applied it to some of the techniques of smithcraft, among them principles of flow and of fracture. He produced many designs, and under Nethade's command and the spur of fear, thrall and soldier were pressed into feverish labor to give them form. Walls were strengthened with subtly formed buttressing, and gates reached by ramps cunningly shaped so that the press of an attack would spend itself against its own numbers, catching them in tight curves or forcing them off sides that narrowed suddenly and imperceptibly, or across bridges that seemed rock firm, yet could be collapsed in a second. The gates themselves often led into lanes or corridors that were worse traps, bringing the attackers under the defenders' fire from unexpected angles and penning them against another and stronger gate. And the following summer, an ambitious barrier began to be built across the northwest of the land, linking the various fortresses and walled towns into a defense to replace the gate fortress. It was not to be a plain wall, but an intricate, meandering tangle of corner and curve, sometimes linked by bridge or tunnel, and filled with hidden traps and barriers as before. This, like the rest, was born of Elof's restless mind. But he took no part in its building, did not so much as set eyes upon the site, for Nethade forbade him still to leave the island. It became ever more clear, though, that at least the builders had to keep in direct touch with him And so, grudgingly, the king allowed Rock to go to the sites and report the problems. At first, he was heavily guarded and restrained, but by their third autumn of captivity, this was proving too cumbersome, and he was free to travel with only a pair of guards, and to go more or less where he willed. He enjoyed these excursions for many reasons, and often returned looking smug and well cared for. But Elof grudged him none of the diversions he found. Had he missed the company of women, Nithade would have lavished them on him as he did all other good things. But he shriveled at the idea. As a maimed wreck he saw himself. He had little stomach, too, for betting thrall girls, who would not dare refuse him, and always Kara was a flutter of wings across his heart. He had, in any event, always more work than he could manage, and when that palled, he had a strong interest of his own, almost an obsession, to eat up any spare time he could find. This was the search for some greater source of heat than his forge. So many of the texts he had surrounded himself with half hinted at great secrets of his craft that high heat might unveil or unleash. And nested within one such, like a pearl within a pearl, might lie the secret of his release. When the fourth winter of his captivity came, it added urgency to his quest, for it grew bitterly cold even before the year's ending. Blasting snowstorms swept land and river, and though they settled only lightly upon the island, they cut it off from the city for days on end. And though the smithy seemed to remain warm, the supply of fuel for his forge was often very near its end. The trees of the island tempted him, but still he could not bring himself to cut them down. So he set himself to study all that he could set down upon the nature of heat, and went in his reading from the minuteness of nature to the heights of the sky, yet remained, it seemed, little the wiser. Into the strange affinity of the sun with glass he delved. He gazed at it through smoked glass, shattered thick glass into slivers so sharp they split its very light into streaks of gorgeous color. He concentrated its rays through fine-ground globes and sections of globes until it grew to a firing heat. But even gathering that within his gauntlet could not bring him the fierce radiance he needed. And the sun was anything but constant. He considered the gauntlet itself and sought to shape new crystals that would drink in all forms of heat and direct them as that one within the gauntlet did, but with greater duration and intensity. He failed, achieving only such weaker crystals as the Duergar used in their undying lamps. And from then on, the steady glow of the forge became a new mark for mariners on the river, but one at which they shook their heads and spat. And searching through the other skills taught him by old Ansgar and Ills, he began to inquire into the strange properties manifested by certain of the metals ordinarily less useful to smiths, being too heavy and soft even for jewelry. But some of the old texts confirmed what the Duergar had hinted at, the uncanny dangers encountered in the refining and storage of such stuff. He grew excited at that, for it seemed to hold the promise of great power. But at the same time, he furthered his researches very slowly and carefully. He grew more interested in the stuff called stone's blood, which was a pitchy seepage that issued from the ground in some southern regions of the land, as it did more rarely in his own. It was little thought of, since it burned poorly in lamps and smelt terrible. Only the poorest used it. But an early smith whose accounts he read, in seeking to purify it, had arrived at some strange substances, some very combustible. Even though he improved greatly upon the process of purification, however, they remained cumbersome, and the results were disappointing. The essences of the stone's blood proved incredibly dangerous and volatile to store, and more than once the smithy was almost burnt to the ground. But that impelled him to turn them to other uses, and through blending them with a variety of other substances, he was able, in the 5th summer of his thraldom, to place into Nethaid's hands a weapon of devastating effect. At first, he used a thick form of the tar, mixed to a sticky paste with sulfur, wax, and powders of rare metals, that was formed into a bolus and shot flaming from a catapult. Where it struck, it clung and burned, and could not easily be dislodged or put out. Against wooden walls or roofs it had fearsome effects, and landing among close-packed troops or horsemen, the bolus could cause panic. By its aid, the siege of an outland tower was raised, and the town of a lordling who had in desperation sought to ally himself with the Reavers was bloodily taken. But the Eqwesh had by now reached the main rivers, and were seizing enough boats to make them a serious threat to traffic. Elof distilled a thinner essence that floated when it was poured upon water, and could be fired there to form a barrier of flame before pursuing ships. This, though effective at first, had many disadvantages. Chiefly that the flames were liable to blow back in the wind before it could bear the boat free of them. Also, once the Eqwesh came to recognize the tactic, they could steer clear in time. When poured from a battlement, its flames often exploded about the wall, enveloping defender as well as attacker. When word of this was brought to Elof, he labored long and hard, drawing again upon his memories of his time among the Duergar and the mysterious weapons they could wield, and produced yet another essence of the stone's blood, this time a thin jelly that could be passed through a pump. Even the crude syringe used to clear the bilges of little fishing boats could jet it through the air to splatter an opponent's sail, where an arrow with the merest spark of tinder would fire it. From larger ships, special pumps could spray it in a dense cloud that would soak into sail, clothes, and deck alike, or, with great daring, could be inflamed by a heated wire at the pump's mouth, engulfing whatever it touched in a searing cloud that rivaled dragon's breath. After a while, the mere sight of pump and fire arrows caused all but the hardiest of the Reavers to hang back and delay their attack, if not turn aside altogether. On land, also it was effective, able to spit its venom beyond a besieged wall or into the rearward ranks of an assault, and so split its force. This Mage Smith's fire, as it came to be called, was not a conclusive weapon. It was perilous to produce, perilous to store, most perilous of all to wield in the panic of battle, where more than once it claimed those who used it uncautiously. In the chill of that 5th winter, when the malice of the ice was strongest and the hardened Eqwesh had the vantage, its flame burned feebler and less certain. But still, Elof had armed his captor with the most terrible weapon of war that ancient land had seen, and one of enduring effect. Such were the concerns in which Elof lost himself during the first 5 years of his captivity. He did not, however, cut himself off from the world. On the contrary, he still took an almost fanatical interest in the progress of Nethaid's campaigns, when he could get any news of them. But as his sorcerous repute grew, so this was becoming harder. Even the guards were loath now to stay and talk, save a few who remembered him from the first. The sergeant alone would linger for a stoup of wine and a few words, and let slip once over some strong wine that his men held him in great awe for his daring. Few others ever appeared. The king had commanded that none should set foot upon the island without his express permission, and most were glad enough to leave it so. When a fisherman was wrecked there during a winter storm, Elof and Rock would have sheltered him gladly enough, but the wretched man would not come near the sorcerer's tower, stayed out all night in the howling rain, and seemed vastly relieved to be summarily arrested by a guard boat he contrived to signal next morning. The nearest they had to an intruder was one morning when they were awakened near dawn by a sudden crashing from the forge. Rising in haste with weapons, they found that one of the little mammoths had strayed in, lured by some leftover fruit. It led them on a wild and shattering chase between the benches, trunk and tail held aloft, squealing and trumpeting wildly, before they at last ejected it. Beyond that, they were hardly disturbed from 1 month's end to the next. So it was that Elof had another reason to be glad of Rock's frequent excursions. So also, he even came to welcome Nithade's occasional visits to demand some new labor, when he would bombard the king with barbed questions about the state of the wars and the advance of the ice. Nithade was curt in his answers at first, but as the years passed he would appear more and more frequently at the forge, sometimes for no very important purpose. Once or twice, in the earliest days, he would bring one or other of his sons to be outfitted with some gift he had commanded, armor or weaponry fit for a young prince. But he would often linger to talk long after the work was done, though the boys, their greed assuaged, grew bored and clamorous to return. Eventually it dawned on Elof that the king also had come to enjoy these visits to men with whom he could speak straightly, and be answered as straightly, without thought of fear or favor. He would spend long evenings sitting by the forge, drinking mulled wine with the man who had sworn to kill him, and bandying hard words about the state of his realm. They were strange evenings, for between king and captive there was no slightest mellowing of feeling. At times the air seemed sulphurous with their rancor. Yet equally there was a kind of fellowship between them, a sense of bearing swords in a common struggle, and of satisfying a common need. Elof was desperate to know all that was passing, and sometimes it seemed almost as if Nithade was seeking counsel.
"Without having to ask for it either,"
Rock pointed out cynically.
"Saves him lowering himself. He knows you're all too ready to bend his ear."
This was the truth, for though he might approve Nithade's valor on the battlefield, Elof never masked his contempt for his way of rule. This was not only to suit his whim. By provoking Nithade, he often learned more. "The poor folk of this land," Nithade jeered at some such sally of Elof's one dark night in the middle of the 6th winter. "Where's your fine concern for them, then? Be ye so eager to see me dead? Where they be without me? Rags rent between the teeth of the battling barons, that's all, and easy prey for the ice after that. Who do you think take my place? You, eh? Is that what you had in mind? Think they'd follow a limping tinker, do you?" He buried his blunt nose noisily in his wine mug, and blew a deep, rumbling sigh. The lines in his face seemed to deepen, and Elof noticed with a quirk of surprise how much grayer his hair had grown since their first encounter. "No, Valant, if you truly wish to help the drudges, you'll swink as you're doing, and forget all your foolish fancies.
They're born to burdens and blows. It's in their blood. They've not the mind to feel the pain of them like higher-born folk, or even master smiths. A strong lord over a quiet kingdom, that's when they fare best. They know it, too, all save a few malcontents. And it's what I'll give 'em. The throne's no chair of ease, but I've no mind to quit it yet, for you or anyone. At least, till my lads are of age.
Then, when he had gone, Rock grimaced at Elof.
I didn't like the sound of that.
Nor I, mused Elof, remembering the flushed faces of the youths who had watched his torture, and the bright, greedy eyes. You've heard something of them, these lads of his, I remember. Are they like their father?
I have, and more,
Rock rumbled disdainfully.
There's chatter enough about them round the court. Aye, it's said that they're like him, but I think not. There's two of them, Giraid and Kinnerek, and all too close in years, not the least.
Jealous, then?
Aye, so I've heard. For all they're so alike. Of each other, but more of him. For all he dotes on them and spoils them rotten. Not that they show it, though. They're careful to play the devoted sons and brothers before him, and the merry swaggers before the common folk, but less so of letting their tongues wag before servants, or bragging to the thrall lasses they bed. So I get all the gossip, for the girls don't like 'em one bit. Cocky young bastards, and nasty-minded with it, that's the word. A lot of the troops favor them, though, and so also a lot of the folk. Nethade's too hard a taskmaster for some, and they blame him. Would you credit for not seeing off the Ekwesh sooner? Seems to me the lads are taking pains to foster that.
He paused significantly. You mean they've already got their eye on the succession before they're even of age?
Wouldn't surprise me a bit. No less did Nethade at their age. But he worked hard to inherit the kingdom, and fought hard and brutal for his father, putting down rebel lords and Ekwesh reavers. These two don't seem of the same metal. They want everything the easy way, and now. There's been talk of compounding with some of the more troublesome lords, giving them local independence for the sake of quiet.
Or support, mused Elof. But don't the young fools see there's no end to that, save with the Ekwesh? All Nethade's vicious ambition, but without his vision, or his driving will. Ready to sell the morrow to buy the moment. I'm glad I made that armor as well as I did, Rock. I'd as soon nothing happened to Nethade. Not yet. That thought brought him some greater consolation for the loss of Gorthar, for it was born into battle as he no longer could, and he heard of Nethade doing greater deeds than ever with the black blade in his hand. That 6th long winter of his captivity was the first time in Nethade's reign that not even one Ekwesh raid penetrated the heartland successfully. Most were met and driven back among the wildlands to the north, and the few who slipped through broke harmlessly against the new fortifications. But neither blade nor walls could turn the weather, and where the Ekwesh failed to go, the storm winds came. Sieges they laid with floods and drifting snow, and after them, quieter and deadlier, the frosts, to crack stone in the still night and lay deadly fingers upon the hearts of those who lacked shelter and fire enough. Nor was that the only terror of the night. The weather drove wolves down in hungry packs from the wildlands, and the huge forest bears, with many other beasts, some among them of an unheard-of strength and ferocity. From byre or pen, a terrible screaming would be heard as of beasts fear-maddened. So terrible that many feared to go out to them even though all their wealth and livelihood were threatened. The more so as many who did never returned, and were found in the first light butchered among their flocks. The beast responsible was never caught, or even seen clearly, and so wildly did accounts vary that it seemed there must be many, yet the manner of attack was always the same: the skull crushed and the brain devoured. Often wayfarers were attacked thus on overgrown paths by something that lay along a stout branch above and struck downwards with a vast paw. Yet this also was never clearly seen, and through storm and blizzard still stranger shapes stalked, and men abroad were missed till the thaw uncovered their gnawed bones. On the clear nights, shadows thin and spider-limbed lurked in thickets for the unwary traveler, or, beneath the haloed moon, climbed through unbarred windows to suck the lifeblood from sleepers within. "This is how it must have been at the fall of Morven, Rock," said Elof on one such clear night towards the winter's end, as they opened their door before sleep to gaze upon the Yscanus, sparkling in starlight. The distant shore shone white with snow, but upon the island it lay lightly among the grass. Do you remember how Corentin spoke of it?
"Aye, do I. But Caris is far from falling yet. The glaciers are a long way from even its outermost walls."
Yet they can travel fast at need. And Loki spoke of only having to tip the balance a little, make the world a trace colder. But how? To overrun this great land is scarcely a small work, even for the ice. Rock grew thoughtful.
"If it froze the Yscanus as it did the great waters of Morven, no, that couldn't work."
No. Sea lakes are one thing, a river well nigh the width of a sea another. The most Loki and her kind might do is freeze the gate falls and dam the main inflow, and I guess they would be hard put to it to do that till the sea ice itself came south. His words faltered, he choked, caught his breath, and suddenly, with a great thrust of his crutches, he hurled himself out of the door into the darkness. Rock, plunging after him in astonishment, saw him raise a hand to the sky as to claw down the very moon or stars. But then he also saw the shadow sweeping over the snow, the shape that cast it, blacker still against the shimmering sky as it glided down towards them. Low it came, and lower, long-necked and graceful, shivering the moonbeams with its speed and the still air with the slow pulse of its wing beats. Nigh over Elof's head it swept, so close that the wind of its outstretched wings uplifted his tangled hair, yet not quite close enough to touch. Despairingly he lunged upward, arms outthrust in a wild embrace, and shouted out in his great voice a name like a cry of agony. "Kara!" Stay, Kara! Only stay a while! A wild embrace, but futile. For even as he gave voice, the dark wings lifted over the roof tree and vanished over the snow-hung crowns of the oaks. He fell headlong among the frosty grass and screamed aloud in frustrated fury. "Damn these corpse legs! Kara! Ah, Kara!" He called after her again and again, but the great swan did not reappear. Out into the icy silence of the night his strong voice rang, across the river at the heart of the world, and it seemed that the waters trembled in answer, and the mirrored stars shook. But it was no more than a breath of wind, coming to stir the leafless trees above, and rustle the grass about their feet. Elof, scrabbling for his crutches, looked dimly down at it. "Rock?" he inquired in a wholly different tone, vague and distracted. "I've hardly looked at this grass of late. There's scarcely any snow here." Rock shrugged and helped him back to his feet. That sudden vision had left him almost as shaken as Elof. He was glad of anything else to talk about.
"There never is. Not much. Same every winter."
"Yes. Hela's fires! Idiot that I've been, never to think of it. And the smithy, so warm and comfortable. Rock, whoever built it as it first was, he was a great smith, building a forge to suit him, a worthy forge. I should have seen that at once." Rock looked hard at him. He seemed almost to have forgotten what he had seen.
"You did. We both did. So?"
So, would not he also have needed great heat?
"He might, aye, he might at that. But whatever he got it from, it's gone now."
"Is it? Come inside. Come." He hobbled toward the bench laden with his present studies, bent beneath the weight of books and notes. "So many forms of heat I've studied." He picked up sheaves of parchment scraps, tablets, wooden slips, tossing them aside one after another. The sun, crystals, stone's blood, strange metals. All this time, and I forgot what was most obvious to me. He seized a map from among the clutter, brushed a table clear of tools with a single sweep of a crutch, and in a crackle of crisp linen unrolled the map across it. "Rock, you've traveled widely enough in the land by now. You can tell me. Those Los Kvednith, those fire mountains like the ones we saw, whereabouts exactly do they lie? No, don't show me. Mark them in with the charcoal here."
"Well,"
began Rock slowly, and then with growing irritation.
"Does it have to be now? I need my bed. I'm too sleep-ridden to remember. I don't know where every single one is. There's too many, large and small. It seems they've been spreading lately, and in some places there's a whole lot close together."
"Just the major ones, and mark regions where they're grouped." "Yes, so." Yawning, Rock cudgeled his weary brain, and made his charcoal circles, here and there as they came to mind, in no particular order. But after a moment he stopped, blinked down at the map a moment, and swore. "Yes?" demanded Elof keenly.
"This. Did you foresee this? You did, didn't you? I could see it in those cat's eyes of yours. Or as somebody whispered something in your ear.
Foresee what? Grinned Elof. Rock's mouth twisted impatiently, and he drew a single savage slashing streak across the map and plucked it up under Elof's nose.
That!
Elof whistled softly. That they'd form a pattern, yes. I learned something about the flow of earth fires from the Master Smith, and more among the Duergar that within the shell of the world there are vast and shifting stresses, that the shell is broken along many lines.
Like fractures in fatigued metal, you mean?
Aye, very like. And it is along these that the earth fires break out at their fiercest. One such ran up through the Menetskahas in our old homeland, and among the Nordenbergen. But in our east land, almost none, and no fire mountains. Whereas here, I never foresaw that the line would run thus. His finger traced the streak of dark ash that linked the marked fire mountains in a single straight line, dead straight across the land of Karis. And some 2/3 of the way along that line, the finger slowed and rested, and a tremor of excitement crept into his voice. Nor that Elon Goranhayan would sit so squarely upon it.
You can't be that precise.
Close enough. Somewhere here. Somewhere by here.
Such as,
objected Rock, seeing Elof cast about like a hunting dog on the scent.
Do we not know every corner of this island by now? Who better? Have we not trodden over every damned finger's breadth of it? Aye, even you, in all the years we've been here?
The warmth, the half-melted snow. Elof flung back at him.
Aye, but how would we get to it? Have we not even seen the forge stripped down to its foundations and rebuilt? So, where could anything lie hidden?
Elof stared at him a moment, then snapped his fingers and swung about on his crutches. He turned towards that last room left of the old lodge. That was still Rock's bedchamber. But Rock seized his arm.
No, damn you. You're not going to start ripping up walls or floor before I've had this night's sleep, at least. If there's anything there, it won't be gone by morning.
Elof glared at him, then half smiled and threw up his hands in defeat. Very well. Till morning, then. And he appeared to compose himself for sleep no less willingly than Rock. To all appearances, he had indeed forgotten the coming of the swan altogether. But more than once in the night, Rock was awakened by the restless tapping of crutches about the forge, and a muttering voice that seemed to be repeating questions to itself over and over in a tone of growing desperation. The fires. What was she doing here? What did she mean? What could she hope to gain? Would it not work against her? Was it mockery? Was it? Was it? It was as much in pity as in irritation that Rock turned over and stopped his ears with the blankets. But he swore loudly when he was awakened at the very first light by Elof, hunched on his crutches, ripping a length of timber from the rear wall. He had seized a boot to hurl when he stopped, sat back among his blankets, and stared at the surface that was being revealed. It had been covered, once, with some kind of sandy concretion, plastered tight against the surrounding rock. Then the new surface must have been hard to tell from old. But now the concretion was decayed, and it was crumbling back to damp sand, as if the immense weight of years had suddenly descended upon it. Beyond it was a jumble of heavy rocks, some that looked naturally fallen, others piled clumsily as if by hands hasty or nervous. These Elof was already pulling away, and finding beneath them a blackness that was not emptiness. He plucked away another stone from the pile, and half of it slid into the gap he had opened. But it landed with a dull clangor that no stone ever made. Rock, amazed, put down his boot and grabbed for his clothes. It was mid-morning before the two smiths had the door cleared, for door it was, though all of metal and bound with steel, and set at a slant backward beneath a low arch in the rock. Clearly, there was a descent beneath. "Stairs, I'll wager," said Elof breathlessly, running his fingers over the surface, stained but only mildly corroded for all the damp. Now those locks must have been full of muck already when this thing was walled up. They're set solid, but I'd guess we could cut the stone around the bolts, or if not, chisel through to the hinges.
"Hold hard," grunted Rock. "First, I want my breakfast. I do. Second, if you're right, who knows what that door may hold back? Could get more earth fires than you want."
For answer, Elof banged his crutch hard down upon the center of the door, and Rock nodded as he heard the hollow boom die away.
"All right. There's still breakfast."
Elof's first idea proved the best. The stone was hard of its kind, but their chisels were harder. They cut clean through to the recesses that received the bolts, and all around the sleeve of steel that lined it. Elof levered it free, peered at it, and scratched the bared bolt ends with a sharp probe. Strong work, scarcely touched by corrosion. There are virtues on it for that, but it owes as much to skillful alloying, I would guess. What are the hinges, I wonder? Before Rock could stop him, he dug in his fingers beneath the lip of the ancient door and heaved. Rock sprang up with a cry. He heard clearly the cracking of Elof's muscles, and a minute later, the sharper crack of wood as the prop of Elof's crutch bent beneath the weight. But he was too late to prevent. He could only hurl his weight against the door as it lifted with a metallic screech that tore his ears. Halfway it rose in a shower of grime and rubble, and there it jammed, even as the tortured prop snapped beneath Elof's left armpit and stabbed like a blunt knife into his arm.
"Might have been your heart, and serve you right,"
raged Rock, tugging out splinters of wood no more gently than he needed to.
"Into your 5th year thus, and still you won't learn what you may and mayn't manage."
Elof winced and mumbled rebelliously as the wound was bound up, though till his outburst of the night before, he had hardly even grumbled about his infirmity these last 2 years. He kept staring down into the opening his haste had made. It looked like a well of darkness, gathering from the skies above, for their labors had lasted all the short day. The moment Rock was done, Elof seized another pair of crutches, with no sign of pain, lit a plain oil lantern, and leaned over the sloping lip of metal and into the dark. "A stair it is!" he exclaimed, with grim satisfaction.
"If you're feeling generous,"
added Rock, looking askance at the roughly stepped stone slabs, covered in dirt and fallen rock, and the dim earth floor they led to.
"do you use your wits for once and let me take the lead?"
Elof grinned and made no protest. Rock helped himself to a stout spear from the litter of arms about the forge walls, and gingerly lowered himself down the metal ramp that led from the rim onto the first step. Then Elof's hard hand landed on his shoulder. "Stand a moment. Do you not smell anything?" Rock shrugged.
"Stale air. Are you surprised?"
Stale, but not damp. No mold, no niter, as we found in Morven, dry though it was. Rock nodded.
"It's warm, right enough. I can feel it in the air. And there's something more."
He hooked the lantern over the spearhead and dangled it down into the dark. Its light swung tantalizingly over shadowy shapes along the walls, then dimmed as the wick guttered and flickered.
"Bad air."
But breathable. The lamp still burns, and there's no mine fume to flame in the air about us, at least. With gasps of painful effort, Elof heaved himself down onto the stairs. Rock tactfully ignored him, but swept a path clear as he went. Elof worked his way down after him, clutching at every shelf and outcropping in the rock to steady himself. But before either had reached the floor, he stopped. "Feel it," he hissed, and Rock, reaching out to the stone, stared at the distant thrill and quiver that was almost like touching the flanks of a living beast. He knew it well, just as it had shivered through the stone foundations of the Mastersmith's tower where he had grown up.
"Earth fires it is,"
he nodded, grimacing at the altogether too generous layer of grime that had come off on his fingers.
"You were right. And look here."
He stepped down onto the floor and swung the lantern around the wall ahead. Rows of murky shapes stood ranged upon stone shelves cut out of the very wall. Pot and crucible and mold case, draped deep in ancient spiderwebs that the fine grime had turned to black lace. An encrusted block, like a petrified table, stood in mid-floor.
"An underground workshop it must have been. See there. All those shelves. The walls go right back. And those vents in the wall there, full of rubble. They'd be fireplaces, but with the chimneys stopped up or fallen in. Have a care, the floor slopes down."
"So it does," grinned Elof. "And where to, think you?"
"Another door, of course,"
Rock announced.
"I can see it, too. Good and solid. Set deep in the stone. Sliding back into it, I'd say. Looks like there's your furnace right enough."
Elof nodded absently, running his fingers along the litter on the shelves. But for the deep layers of grime, they might have been his own store, or any true mastersmith's. A jumble of uncompleted pieces, old molds, leftover metal and offcuts, coils and coils of wire. Or was it wire? It felt fine as hair. Disturbingly like hair, in fact. He made a mental note to rummage through the mess at the first chance he had. Who could say what fascinating relics his predecessor might have left? But then he heard Rock swear explosively, and turned to hobble down the steep floor after him. The reason became obvious as Rock held up the light. The air here was worse, if anything, and it shed only a faint glow upon the wall around the furnace door. but it was enough to show the wheel which must work the gear's running gear, and the broken lengths of chain which dangled from it. He pointed up to the ceiling.
Must run up through those holes there to some kind of counterweight system, probably up above. That must have gone with the original forge, decayed or torn down or both. Be damned to it. We'll have to rig the whole thing again before we can get at the furnace.
Elof chuckled and turned away up the slope. Now who's turned impatient? If we must, we must. I've hauled open doors enough for one day. Let's go and see whether there's any sign of the holes above, or those chimneys. I could use a breath or two of clean air. He looked back when he reached the stairs, but Rock was still engrossed and not listening.
If the wheel still moves, he muttered, it might just be.
He thrust a spear shaft through the spokes of the wheel and leaned upon it hard. Nothing happened. The wheel showed no sign of stirring. But Rock, brushing his hair from his eyes, was not to be thwarted. Now he was throwing his whole weight upon the spear, dangling from it almost as his feet left the ground.
Leave it, Rock,
called Elof.
Later soon enough. No, by hella, a moment more,
gasped Rock through clenched teeth. Elof wondered if the bad air had gone more swiftly to the shorter man's head.
I'm getting there.
And indeed, there was a faint sound, a hum, a groaning of ancient wheels at the edge of hearing. And beyond that, the deeper rumble that he had felt in the walls.
It's moving. Shifting.
Elof sighed and turned back to help. But then his glance fell upon those fireplaces in the walls. They did not really look like... Something, a flash of understanding, seemed to whirl around in his head. He shouted aloud and sped for the wall in great swinging leaps. As was bound to happen, his crutches skidded from under him on the grimy slope. But he flung himself forward, and, even as the dark door moaned and squealed into movement, he crashed against the wheel, clutched at a spoke, and sagged down so that his weight blocked Rock's leverage.
"No!"
he yelled.
"Don't you see? Those aren't fireplaces. They're air vents. And this muck, it's soot." "What?"
bellowed Rock, but he dropped from the spear and let it clatter to the floor. "That's not the furnace. We're in the furnace." There was a sudden sharp hiss, and Rock stumbled hastily back as a jet of white fumes burst around the rim of the door. Then Elof's weight told. The wheel sank back that vital fraction, and the rumbling died away. Rock staggered over, coughing and contrite.
Belly of hell! What was I going to do? What was I going to do? They'd have seen us on the mainland and never known it. One flash, a wisp of smoke, and farewell Smiths.
And a brace of hot cinders down Nethade's fat neck, coughed Elof, and fought to keep from laughing hysterically. Powers! These vapors, they've got me too. They must pool here like water. Rock hauled him loose and got his crutches under him, and they more or less dragged each other up the slope. When they got out into the open, they sprawled gratefully on the cold grass under a sky grown murky and showing few stars. Rock, still muttering reproachfully to himself.
Why didn't I bleedin' well see? Those vapors are cause enough, coughed Elof, hugging his ruined legs. Maybe, but you saw. I was further up the slope. They took longer to get to me. And even on crutches, I'm taller than you. We both should have realized at once. From the soot. But it's so ancient it's congealed halfway to Earth. Or the door mechanism, meant to be opened from above. And for good reason. We weren't expecting it. That was half the trouble. Who would have thought of so vast a furnace? What'd he ever use it for? That's what puzzles me. Aye, me too. I've seen forges no bigger than that. He could have worked in there. He stopped short, and they looked at each other. Don't suppose he did, do you? Elof shook his head in awed disbelief at the image of some huge figure standing silhouetted against the fearsome glare from that open door, hammer rising and falling as the vapors swirled around him, laboring away at that block in the floor. It could be an anvil. Those things on the shelves, stuff he wanted kept warm, ready to hand. Ours. What sort of creature can he have been? Elof shook his head. Not human. No creature of flesh and blood could live long in such a furnace at its full heat, among those vapors. No, the idea's impossible. Unless... Yes. What? A dedicated smith. Very dedicated. Ready to go down and work there before the furnace had cooled. Yes, he might have achieved a great deal. A very great deal. Rock smote his brow. Aye, he might, if he'd no mother wits, and 2 good legs to get him out whenever his clothes took fire. He seemed to see Elof's wince in the darkness, for he added, more gently, No point in sparing you that truth, for it's as true as that you saved my life there once again, legs or no. Chalk it up to luck. We'll settle the slate at the end. I've done well out of it, Rock. I've got my furnace now. We'll rig that opening wheel again, and clear the air shafts, and set the whole thing to work again. There's things I've been thirsting to try. Speaking of thirsting, interrupted Rock, I've labored enough for one day. Me for a drink and a bite and bed. Down by the hearth as you've torn my fine bedchamber asunder. And the same for you, if you're wise. No, I've still got the stink of those fumes in my chest. I'll sit out a while longer. As you will, but don't go to sleep in the frost, or it'll take more than that forge to unstiffen you come morning. Sleep you well. The door clattered shut, and left Elof alone with himself beneath the clouds. He bowed his head almost to his knees, and sought to rein in his racing thoughts of smithcraft, of pain and humiliation at his crippled state, of half-formed, half-dreamed ways of escape that the furnace might now make possible. Then he looked up. Rock came running when he heard the cry, and found himself halfway to his feet, one leg kicking uselessly against the slippery ground. As he stared frantically into the night, Rock caught the faintest glimmer of something that came fluttering slowly down, like a dark snowflake.
Then he jumped as Elof hurled away his crutches and plunged to his knees so hard that one splint broke, scrabbling furiously among the whitened grass.
"What, man? What is it?"
demanded Rock, horrified as he stooped to help him. He snorted with surprise at what Elof held up with a gasp of triumph.
"Is that all? A crow's cast-off?"
The long feather shook in Elof's grasp, and he swept the sides with his gaze. This is too great for any crow. Should I not know the pinion of a swan? None better. And what other swan have you seen in all the world that is black? Rock sucked in his lower lip with a shock.
"Can you see anything?"
No, nothing. Not even a star.
"Kara!"
The shout was so sudden, so anguished, that Rock jumped. But to Elof's own ears, it sounded like a wail of weakness, and he bit it off. What woman would come to a call as miserable as that? "Help me up," he muttered, devouring the feather with his eyes.
"What can it mean?"
Rock demanded, handing him back his crutches.
"Is it a token or—"
A token? Yes. But of what? Hope? Scorn? Rock, I know not what to think. That she's here in these regions at all, this deep within the land, it may bode ill. Does Louhi ready some sudden assault? Swaying on his crutches, he clenched his fists at the skies and howled with sudden anguish. Was it scorn she meant? Was it? A curse! Eternal light upon my helplessness, and upon him who brought it about. You stern powers of life and death, be my judges. Are the sorrows of men worth no more than laughter? Are we in our miseries mere playthings of your scorn? Then shatter, world, as in the end you must, and shorten all agonies. And the fires of Hela at your heart consume us all.